With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics right here on News Radio 1440, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. As always, I'm your host, Caleb Colquitt. We appreciate you making us a part of your day here on this Monday evening, whether you're joining us on YouTube, Facebook Live, Mixer, Twitch, Twitter, Periscope. We're on every channel that you can think of at this point. And as you can probably tell by the background behind me, today is President's Day, in case you didn't know. Now, if you're a state employee, which we have a lot of those, of course, in the city of Montgomery, but, you know, in our larger broadcasting area in the state of Alabama, you may not have picked up on that, and I find that really a shame because we don't make as big a deal out of President's Day as we used to. And it's not that I think that the presidency, the office itself, because of course it's placed in February because Washington and Lincoln, probably our two most famous presidents, both have birthdays in that month, but it is something to honor all presidents collectively. It's to honor the office itself, not just one individual person or just the presidents that you like. It's a celebration of all presidents. And, you know, just like any other human being or group of human beings in this particular instance, when you do that, there's going to be some good and some bad, but it's to celebrate the good and the presidency itself. And I find it distressful that an awful lot of companies will no longer offer President's Day off when they'll offer a whole lot of other holidays off. One thing that's kind of always been a point of contention with me is that they'll have some weird holidays off, and there's some that even may deserve it, but President's Day is one that you don't get off. And I want to make one thing clear. I'm in favor of getting off more often, so I'm not suggesting that we have less holidays and also work on President's Day. I'm saying we should also get President's Day off too. But hey, that's just one man's opinion. But I want to discuss the office of the presidency and the nature of it, because I think that that's one thing that gets lost a lot of times when we talk about politics, because normally when you talk about the presidency, what that conversation typically is about is the specific men that have held that office. Nothing wrong with that. If you've watched this program for any length of time, you know we spend quite a bit of time talking about that as well. We do it right now while Trump is in office. We did it back when President Obama was in office. Now, granted, I can't go back any further than that because those are the only two men that have been in office since I've had a show. So that's the extent of my history with it. But, you know, President Obama, a guy I disagreed with a lot. President Trump, a guy I occasionally disagree with, but agree with more often than not. And so that's really the only commentary I have on that when it comes to presidents that I've had the ability to comment on while they were actually sitting in office. But that's typically what happens. You're either talking about how much you like or dislike the specific president, either now or in the past. President's Day really should be more about that, more than just that. It should be about the office itself, and that's one of the reasons that I figured we would elevate the conversation a little bit by talking about the office of the presidency, not just President Trump or President Lincoln or President Obama or President Wilson or whoever else you may want to pull out there out of the 45 men behind me here on this background. By the way, our graphic designer, Jessica Dawson, whipped this up really quickly, so we appreciate that. So, to understand most things, the best thing that you can do is go back to the origin. I mean, that makes sense to us. If you want to understand, for example, human nature, what do? Well, one of the things that you can do, and a good place to start, is to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. If you want to understand virtually any concept, typically going back to the point of origin is a good way to help you understand that, and the presidency really is no different. So, how exactly did we come up with the idea of having a president in the first place? How did America come up with this? Well, the thing is, to understand that and to understand exactly what the president was originally intended to do and what the founders envisioned a president's job as, you go back to the Constitution, specifically Article 2 of the Constitution, which lays out the duties of the executive branch. So, one thing that you notice about that, when you're looking through some of the duties of the office of the presidency, you'll notice that an awful lot of the things that he is charged with doing are of an emergency nature. And you may find that a little odd, but there actually is a brilliance behind that. So this is an idea that was taken from the Roman government and taken from their structure, but it was adjusted a little bit to keep them from absorbing too much power, because you may remember the rise of the Caesars came because of a emergency power grab. So what happened is Octavian needed to seize power quickly because Rome was dealing with a military conflict, and in wartime the Senate was basically pushed to the side, and their power was somewhat curtailed by one man that took on that power to be able to act quickly and decisively, which is something that is necessary in a military environment. Because you can't wait around for bureaucracy to take place when you're in the middle of a war. 9 times out of 10, that is a true statement. And so what the founders did was they thought, well, that turned out really badly for Rome. Good idea, good intention. They had the right idea in the sense that they did need one person to look to in times of military conflict for something that was quick and decisive and didn't need to be belabored about in a committee for a long time. So they were right about that. That was something that they wisely put into place in Rome, but we all know how that turned out. What happened is, once that power was grabbed, it was really hard for that person to give that power back. And eventually we had an emperor as opposed to a senate. And that's where the founders realized that something had made a mistake, that they had messed up somewhere along the way. And so here's what they thought of. Instead of it being a temporary person that we put into temporary power, why don't we just do this? Why don't we instead, when it comes to the Senate, why don't we just have a permanent office that is in charge of the military and making those snap-second decisions? That's something that would be more beneficial to us. And so that's what they did. So to keep a single person when we're in the time of a military conflict from absorbing all that power, they just got somebody permanently to sit in that office so he wouldn't have to absorb power. When a military conflict was on, he would just act as the commander-in-chief. And that's why a commander-in-chief is the one that is overseeing military operations and also emergency responses. That's the reason that the executive branch oversees things like, for example, FEMA. And another thing that it does, and this will help you understand the vision that the founders at least put in place, this was a year-round thing. And you may say, well, duh, being president is a year-round thing. That's a no-brainer, Caleb. What are you even talking about? Of course it's always been that way. We can't just have the president going home for 9 months out of the year. Yes, but that used to be more significant. Here's why. Congress did stay home for about 9 or 10 months out of the year. They would rarely stay in session for more time than that. The Supreme Court was actually the same way. The Supreme Court would meet, and technically the Supreme Court still kind of does this. And Congress still has sessions, it's just those sessions are pretty much year-round. The presidency was the only office that the president lived in Washington, stayed in Washington, and the entirety of his term was spent in Washington or going other places doing the business and the duty of the president. See, that was the difference. They had this guy that was basically there just in case of emergency, just in case there needed to be a national response. And that's the reason he was always there when Congress and the Supreme Court really wasn't. Nowadays in Washington, that looks very different because, let's be honest, Congress pretty much meets year-round. And it's definitely a full-time job. And being a Supreme Court justice is definitely a full-time job. But used to, the president was the only one that did that. He was the one in charge of facilitating whatever Congress gave him, whatever bills that they had put out, and he was in charge of enacting it. But because the federal government was so much smaller and it had its hands in so fewer things, it wasn't something that was considered running the economy or something like that. The president executing the orders of Congress, that really wasn't something that took an awful lot of his time. He was still the only permanent one there. But the point is, he was just kind of there to make sure everything was okay, and in case something went wrong, he was there to put out the fire, and that was about it. And it does show you a stark contrast both in the way that we see the president now, and also, and more importantly, how different the vision of our federal government looks now compared to what the founders envisioned it as, something that was very small and didn't need a whole lot of maintenance. And then, when it came to foreign policy, the president plays an important role, of course, as well. You see, Congress is the one that dictates foreign policy. But ultimately, it is the president that handles a lot of that negotiation and carrying that out. There's a reason that the Secretary of State and the State Department as a whole is a branch, or it's a department within the branch of the executive. The president and his staff are the ones that primarily are the face of the American people to other nations and to their governments. And so that's something that was interesting. And keep in mind, part of the reason that the founders put that into place, and that's something that the president has to do, is because, well, in their time, pretty much all the countries were dictatorships or monarchies. There really wasn't another country that had multiple people in a governing body, at least not one that was very impactful. There was a British Parliament, of course, but if the king wanted to undo something Parliament did, more or less, he could do it. He had a few limits on his power, but not many. And so because of that, they felt, well, we've got to have like one guy and a small staff of people, like a Secretary of State, that's in charge of talking to other countries for us. And of course, eventually, that was a system that turned out to work pretty well. They understood the world that they lived in, and they made an accommodation to make sure that the way that they related to other countries was realistic. And that's one of the things that the office of the presidency helps facilitate for them. And this is really something that makes sense, even if because now, of course, most countries don't necessarily operate under a dictatorship or a monarchy. Several still do, but you don't have as many kings or queens as you used to anymore. They still exist, but a lot of the ones that are here now are figureheads, and even though there are some nations that are pretty much run by one person, yes, I'm thinking of you, Vladimir Putin, you do have a lot of nations that have a more republic or more democratic system. So how do you deal with them now? Well, even those nations realize now that it's best to have a single spokesperson or a single spokesperson and their staff around them. It's part of the reason we have the UN, it's part of the reason we have ambassadors to the UN, and part of the reason that they typically have a small staff that is in charge of looking over policy and representing a united front of a nation when entering to negotiations in the UN or just in treaties in general. That's the reason we have a single ambassador to each country. You see, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of functions of government that function best when you have a collective body, like a Congress, like a House of Representatives, like a Senate, or a Parliament. Any of those would fall under that umbrella. But the reason that when it comes to negotiation, presenting a united front works better is because, can you imagine trying to have a negotiation between two countries when in America you've got, I don't know, 3 or 4 Republicans and 3 or 4 Democrats, and they both have very different ideas on foreign policy, and they're trying to negotiate something with another country despite the fact that they can't agree themselves on what they want? Or imagine what it would be like in the British Parliament system where there's 6 parties. And so they're all pulling in different directions, and they all see public policy and foreign policy very differently, and yet they're trying to negotiate with this other committee of people. It doesn't work that way. And that's why our founders very wisely decided to put the foreign relations aspect of our federal government in the hands of the executive. He also handles the law enforcement portion of the federal government, which again is something that's very smart. Congress does have oversight, and they should have oversight. There are checks and balances when it comes to the president being the highest law enforcement officer in the country, which of course he is. But ultimately, the execution of fulfilling and making sure those laws are abided by, that largely falls to the president. And really, we understand this better if we look at it in a sort of a microcosm, sort of scale it down and look at why this is a good idea. The same thing happens in our towns and communities. For example, the city of Montgomery or the city of Millbrook or the city of Wetumpka, or go on, with all the little towns around in the river region, pretty much all of them have city councils. And that's a good idea, having multiple people discuss things, debate them, present different sides before they come up with an idea of what they're going to do and what's right for their town. And yet, all of the law enforcement side usually happens through either a police chief or a sheriff, but some kind of military-esque hierarchy. And the reason for that is because when it comes to execution of the laws, it's better to have a single person or a small group of people that are just charged with enforcing them, not making the laws. Because when you have a mixing of people that are making laws and enforcing the laws, then it becomes a really big problem. And so because of that, it makes sense for us to separate those duties out to individual governing bodies. And when it comes to enforcing the law, well, that's the work of the sheriff's office or the police commissioner. It's not the job of the council members themselves that are making the laws to then go and enforce them. The same thing is true of the presidency. Congress is the one that is charged with deciding what laws are going to work best for everybody, what laws should be enacted, and which ones should go away. But ultimately, it is the president that signs those into law, which is another check against them. And also, he is the one that is charged with enforcing the law. Now, he is required by law, he is duty-bound by his office to enforce those laws. However, the way that he does so is more or less up to him, unless given specific instructions by Congress, and even then there may be some leeway. The job does fall to him. And so that's one of the most important duties of the president when it comes to this country as well. But you can see how, in all this, that a lot of the gripes of the presidency really stem from a lack of understanding of the presidency and what that office is supposed to do. Because you can think about all the different debates that we've had, and whether you're liberal or Democrat or Republican, conservative, whatever label you want to slap on yourself, any of the gripes that you have had over the course of this time probably stems from, at one point, a misunderstanding of the presidency. Not all of them. Some people understand the office well and still have a gripe with the way that somebody executed that, somebody that held that office. But think about it. A lot of the gripes that people have with the various presidents are because they're doing something that their office was never designed to do. We could take the illegal immigrant debate, for example. A lot of conservatives, myself included, that were for a strong border didn't like the fact that President Obama signed DACA, basically saying, no, I'm just not going to enforce that law. Well, that's not something you're allowed to do. That's not something you're allowed to say. Now, we may have a gripe with how you enforce the law, but you can't just say to this particular undisclosed group of people, no, just not going to enforce the law on that. And then you spin that in the opposite direction. You look at something, for example, the travel ban, where President Trump actually said to certain groups of people, we're not going to be accepting refugees or immigrants from these parts of the world. Well, the reason that a lot of people got upset with that is because Congress abdicated their power and gave a lot of the enforcement on that to the presidency. And so that was President Trump making a decision on something that really he didn't have a whole lot of control over, or at least was never designed to have that control over. He has it now because the Congress basically handed over a lot of their say-so in how that's to be enforced over the presidency. But the truth is, when it comes to things like immigration and naturalization, that's supposed to be up to Congress. The reason that the executive has a lot of power and influence in that particular area of government is because Congress basically handed it over to him through legislation. That's not the way it was originally designed in the Constitution. And that's just one example, and I could go, we would be here for 2 hours if I went through every single one. But essentially, the argument that I'm making here is a lot of the debates that we have with one another about whether or not the president is doing something right or wrong, 9 times out of 10, a lot of those arguments would never happen if we were following the Constitution, because we would be arguing something that the president doesn't even have the power to do. Now, we might still have a vigorous debate over how it should be handled by Congress, but the point is, the presidency should not be deciding a lot of those things. And so a misunderstanding of the office and the purpose and the intended use of it, that creates an awful lot of the arguments that we have amongst ourselves about what a president should or should not do or who the president should be. Now, a lot of this plays back into sort of the general idea and feeling of what the presidency should be. Because a lot of you may not understand, how did we even come up with the name president? And the story actually, I think, teaches an important lesson about what the founders intended. You see, Washington was the president of the Constitutional Convention, and a lot of people assumed that President Washington was going to eventually become the either manager or dictator, as it were, the monarchy, the king of America. They kind of assumed that that was going to take place, and that's part of the reason, I think, that it inspired the name of the executive office to be the president, because Washington had already served as the president of the Constitutional Convention. But what does the word president actually mean? Well, now we think of it as being somebody that's at the top. They're very prestigious. They're somebody that is overseeing the entirety of a group or organization. But the thing is, the presidency was never seen that way. In fact, the word president kind of meant what we would think of today as a manager. So if you were running a McDonald's, for example, let's say that you owned one of their franchises. Well, you would be the president of the Montgomery Atlanta Highway McDonald's. That would be your title, because you're the one that owns it and manages it despite not being the top person of the company. That's how they thought of the word president. That was the connotation that the word president carried with it at the time of the founders. In fact, so much so that you had several of the founders that were debating this and debating what title we should give our executive, because we couldn't go with king because we just got out of a king, even though there were some people that actually did want Washington to be king. We didn't really want to go with king because we had just fought to get under the tyrannical rule of another king. And so we were trying to come up with some kind of title that wasn't quite king, but it still conveyed a level of prestige and honor. And there were a lot of people that argued that presidency was just too lowly a title. They're like, guys, we can't call the person that is running our country the president. Other countries are going to be laughing at us. They won't take us seriously in international negotiations. They're not going to listen to us. They're not going to listen to our president if that's what we call him. It was something that was almost silly. It would be like calling him the shift leader if we were making that argument today. And so because of that, they eventually did wind up settling on president. And the reason that they did is because they didn't want the president to be a dictator. They didn't want him to be a monarch. They didn't want him calling the shots. They wanted him to be a manager. Just like Washington had really not engaged himself in much of the constitutional debate that was going on at the convention. He was merely a facilitator. He made sure that the debate was fair, that people had equal time to speak. He made sure that everybody's ideas got in, that even if somebody was in the minority, their voice was still heard. That's what Washington did at the Constitutional Convention, and it's a large part of the reason that they decided we should call the guy running our country the manager, the president of our country. He's not there to make laws. He's not there to call the shots. He's not there to say, okay, I like this guy, so put him at the front of the line, and this guy, I don't like him, so we're going to hit him with a bunch of fines and regulations and taxes. No, that's not what they wanted at all. That would be a king. What they wanted is just a fair-minded person to sit back and make sure everything runs smoothly, and that's about it. That's really all they envisioned when it came to the presidency. And it's interesting because in this whole debate, it was John Adams that really felt like, especially because of our relations with other countries, that we needed something bigger, bolder, more prestigious, more regal sounding than president. And Adams was a person that was kind of obsessed with names and obsessed with titles. And even though I do admire Adams and think that he was a legitimately good president, with the exception of one particular action that I'm thinking of, when it came to Adams, ultimately, I think the man worried too much about what other people thought. Now, it's funny to contrast that with Thomas Jefferson, the man that immediately came after him, his predecessor. After the presidency, he became, of course, the third president after Adams. You see, with Thomas Jefferson, he didn't really care what people thought of him at all, which is also interesting considering that we're learning all this on President's Day. John Adams and Jefferson, despite being friends and then enemies and then friends again, they were very, very, very different people. Adams was always constantly concerned with what the press was saying about him, how they dealt with his administration, and in fact, there's a very Trumpian quality there. Because Trump is constantly worried what the media thinks of him, how he's going to be remembered, that kind of thing. That's a quality that John Adams himself had. They're very different men in many ways, but they do have that in common. And Jefferson was the exact opposite. People had all kinds of wild insinuations, including one that came out that he was sleeping with one of his slaves, which, by the way, if you look at it historically, there's zero evidence for, and even his enemies at that time, even his enemies at the time Jefferson was living, would said, no, there's nothing to that. Only a handful of conspiracy theorists in his time that despised Jefferson gave that any credibility whatsoever. But part of the reason that some people did believe it is because Jefferson never denied it. And the reason that he did, he gave an explanation. He said, look, when it comes to public life, I don't worry about that stuff. History is going to sort all that out. Adams was the exact opposite. Adams wanted to be involved in everything. Whenever the media hit him, he wanted to punch right back. If there had been Twitter, you can imagine there would have been some very interesting Twitter fights between John Adams and people of the New York Times or whatever other publications were running at the time that he was president. And John Adams had some pretty famous fights with the media, even despite the slow nature of print press. But that really does go to a difference in opinion, and it shows why they ultimately settled on the president. Because, yeah, it didn't sound impressive, and it didn't sound like somebody that had a lot of prestige, and that's ultimately exactly what they wanted. They wanted somebody that wasn't going to take charge. They wanted somebody that was going to basically just facilitate the functions of government. And I think that that is a very important lesson for us too, because the thing is, as the American people, we obsess over who's president. And really the world does to a degree, not as much as we probably imagine, but we obsess over who the president is. I mean, when Barack Obama was in office, it was something that legitimately bothered me all the time. And I think that there were legitimate reasons for that. But my point is, it was something that on both sides we obsess over. And of course now I don't even have to, because we're right in the middle of it, I don't even have to tell you about how the liberal media just obsesses over every single little thing President Trump does, every minute of every day. But ultimately, this is something that is the opposite of what our founders envisioned. Because the truth is, who the president is shouldn't make much of a difference to us. Honestly. I'm not saying that it should make no difference, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be very careful in selecting who our president is. But if the president and the way that government was run operated the way it was intended to be small and unobtrusive and one that really didn't interfere in the personal lives of the citizen very much at all, then it really wouldn't bother us too much if our guy wasn't in the White House. It really shouldn't have bothered me very much that President Obama was in office, ideally, if he had very little power to actually do anything that affected my life. Unfortunately, he did, and he used that power and abused it. And the people on the left feel that Donald Trump is doing the exact same. But if we were following the Constitution, that would be less of an issue, because we would have such a small federal government, and the president would be such a small part of that, that who the president was wouldn't make a whole lot of difference, honestly. And I think that part of the reason that it does is that we as human beings want to attach some kind of prestige to that, and we want one specific person to be our leader. And that's just not a government that functions well. But yet our human nature drives us to want that and to kind of buy into that cult of personality ideology. But who the president is ultimately to us, to the American people, if we were following the Constitution, should be really more of an afterthought. Yeah, it's important. Yeah, it's something that we need to concern ourselves with. But on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't make much difference. That's the way that we should look at it, and that's the way that we should structure our government, go back to that original model so that we could do that. Because both sides are guilty of this, but we can, if we drastically shrank the size of government, get back to a point where whoever the president was, whether it was Trump or Obama or Bernie or Bloomberg, it really wouldn't make much difference because they don't have a whole lot of power to do anything anyway. You see, when Congress abdicated most of its power to the executive, and the Supreme Court largely let them, that's when the presidency became this overpowered, super important thing that can affect policy, regulations, so many different things, because over time, what happened is Congress started giving more and more power to executive branches. And this was especially true when Congress wasn't able to get their way. And so because of that, they would, especially the minority party, would be in favor of bills that abdicated that power to executive branches, and they would put bureaucrats in place that would basically see to their policy proposals without them having to actually do anything, which is a horrible structure because that also means that a lot of our policy and our laws are directly decided by people that are unelectable and cannot be held to account. And the Supreme Court largely allowed this to happen. This is one of the issues that we run into with the way that our government works, is that so much power has been consolidated in the executive branch that Congress has actually become less powerful. And because Congress isn't able to deadlock the way that it used to, and not be able to come to a decision, and the executive branch is largely run on, autopilot for all intents and purposes, that has become part of the reason that it's very hard for us to change our government now. But the truth is, the president should have no impact on our personal life. Presidents, at the end of the day, should be guardians of liberty. And the ironic thing is the only way for them to actually do that is to have very little power. The only way they can be true guardians of freedom is for them to have not very much power at all, to allow that power to be taken care of not only from them but from Congress and the Supreme Court as well, that the individual citizen makes pretty much all of his own decisions. That the federal government has very little influence one way or the other in any citizen's life. And ultimately, the way that the president can do that the best and most effectively is if he himself has very little power. And when proposals come to increase his power, he throws them back at Congress. That's the way to be an effective president that champions liberty. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more on tactics.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me harken back to a comment that was made I would say a few months ago by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election. But one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes, and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy, because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next. The best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farm.
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, we have quite a bit to talk about, but I wanted to point out how ironic this whole thing is, because we just got done talking about the presidency, and now it's time for one that actually kind of directly relates to it. Here we go with the daily dose of stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
So I gave a little tease there to the Daily Dose of Stupid, and it has to do with Michael Bloomberg, who if you live outside of the Super Tuesday states, which of course we don't, Alabama is a Super Tuesday state along with like Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, California. There's several of us. If you live outside of a Super Tuesday state, you probably have heard very little about Michael Bloomberg. But if you live in a Super Tuesday state, boy, you have seen nothing but Michael Bloomberg ads on the internet, on television, on radio. There's several running on News Radio 1440 right now, this second, which, by the way, I'm fine with. May not agree with the guy much, but I don't mind my company taking his money. And it's smart for him because otherwise the only people talking about him on News Radio 1440 are people like me and Levin and Kevin. So, hey, if he wants to buy some ad time, by all means, more power to him. But Bloomberg does have an issue because a clip from 2016 resurfaced, and this is not long after some seemingly racist. Now, I don't think they were racist based on the context of what he was talking about, and it was a poorly worded comment, but it certainly was not one that I think necessitates that the guy is a racist. But that came out last week, and then we have this new clip from 2016, which is resurfaced. And this is really the disadvantage of being a veteran politician in today's climate, is that because of the internet, and because things are so easy to archive and then go back through and search, it is just super, super easy to find somebody making a gaffe or saying something that is unflattering to a certain group of people or saying things that sound stupid. And because of how quickly the woke movement moves now, that is even easier to do because what is offensive changes every single day. So because of that, especially somebody running on the Democrat side, they have it pretty tough because their words can come back to haunt them and can come back to haunt them in a very big way. So I think that this is part of the reason that you're seeing a lot of the people that have never been involved in politics at all becoming more popular. That's something that across the nation has been easier, the threshold has been easier for you to get into, and I think a big part of it, personally, I think a big part of the reason that that is the case is because not having a track record is kind of an advantage. Because there's not a whole lot of bad that they can draw back to from previous years, and Bloomberg is a veteran politician with a lengthy career, been in the public eye an awful lot, and because he was a 3-term mayor of New York City, he made an awful lot of public appearances and did so. And I think Trump, or somebody like Trump who's never been a politician before his first term in office, actually has a little bit of an advantage there, because even though he was a famous person and there was an awful lot of footage of Trump saying, dopey things, he was not a politician, and so he could kind of have the excuse of, well, I'm new at this, and that was before I really studied the issue and that kind of thing. Bloomberg can't really say that because he's been a politician for a long time. So, just so you know, this particular clip, when it resurfaced, the Bloomberg camp said, okay, well, that was taken out of context, and he didn't really mean it that way. So what we've done is we've added the context back to give you the context of what he was talking about with modern farming versus non-modern farming. But nonetheless, I think that, frankly, just my opinion, adding the context doesn't do a whole lot to save face with this because of the nature of what he was saying, but I'll let you be the judge. This is a clip of Michael Bloomberg from 2016.
Think about it. The agrarian society lasted 3,000 years, and we could teach processes. I could teach anybody, even people in this room, so no offense intended, to be a farmer. It's a process. You dig a hole, you put a seed in, you put dirt on top, add water, up comes the corn. The information economy is fundamentally different. You have to have a different skill set. You have to have a lot more gray matter.
So as you can see there, we tried to provide the full context for you, because I do think it's fair that people need to be taken in context. But at the same time, even if you take it, just on his word that what he was talking about was not farmers in general, but specifically modern farming, that still doesn't help him much. And the reason that I say that is because let's say that he's 100% accurate in that. Well, you're still degrading generations of farmers that came before modern farming. You're still degrading the people that literally built this country. And if you're talking to voters that maybe are a generation or two removed from the farm, or even 3 or 4 generations removed from the farm, you're still talking about their grandparents or their great-grandparents or their great-great-grandparents. Granted, that gets a little bit softer a blow the further away you get from it, but the point is, virtually every American has ties back to agriculture if you go back far enough. And a lot of them still have that tie to agriculture pretty closely. And that's especially true, and this is why I find this such a major gaffe for him. That's especially true in the states that Bloomberg right now is trying really hard to win. Because you could get away with saying that in certain states, but in California and Arkansas and Kentucky and Texas and Virginia, and by the way, California as well. Because, yes, California, we think of LA and Hollywood and all that. California's a huge ag state. They've got massively successful dairies, vineyards. There's all kinds of crops that are grown in California because it has such a varied climate. And so if you're running as a primary candidate in the Democrat, you're going to lose a lot of Dixiecrats. You're going to lose a lot of people that are Democrats despite, not agreeing socially with a lot of the Democrats' policies, but, their daddy was a Democrat and their granddaddy was a Democrat. And here's the other thing. If that's the type of person, if that is the type of person that continues to vote Democrat despite the fact that everybody around them has changed and despite the fact that they don't really live in a blue state anymore, do you really think those are the kind of people that are going to take it lightly that Bloomberg is degrading the lifestyle of their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents? I have a feeling the family ties run pretty deep in a person like that. And for Bloomberg trying to get their vote on a stage with, 10 other Democrats now, we've rolled it down to 8, 10 contenders at this point. That's going to be hard to recover from in some of the Super Tuesday states, the very states that he has been running as a part of it. Now, I got to tell you, if I'm somebody, and I don't believe this, but if I'm somebody like Lunch Bucket Joe that's always been seen as the voice of the working man, and he's trying to make this message of Bloomberg shouldn't be just buying all these ads and buying his way into the presidency, and he's only doing this because he's a billionaire, I run that ad nonstop in all of the southern states. I mean, if I'm Joe Biden and I'm hanging on for dear life, that's the first thing I do. I run those ads in Kentucky and Virginia and Arkansas and Texas. If you're Pete Buttigieg, now granted, Buttigieg doesn't have a whole lot of chance in the southern states anyway because he has a problem with black voters and those people are less likely to vote for a gay guy. But if I were Buttigieg, I would do exactly the same thing, especially somebody from a Midwestern state, a breadbasket state like Indiana. I'm not saying that this is like the last nail in the coffin for Bloomberg or that he's going to dry up and go away, but let's not kid ourselves. This is a major gaffe. And when it comes to the whole farming versus the jobs in the information economy, look here, I've done both. I was an ag major at Auburn. I grew up as the son of an ag teacher. My grandfather was a farmer. My great-grandparents were farmers, and if he were able to physically, he would still be farming. He just quit farming a few years ago because he just physically couldn't do it anymore. I've worked on farms. Heck, I've worked with Amish farms. I've been around agriculture my entire life. Done it myself, done it with other people, worked for other farmers. And I've done this too. I mean, this is about as an information age job as you can have. I run an internet talk show. My job literally wouldn't even exist without the internet. I do the radio side of it too, and I get that that's been around for a long time, but the internet side of it, this is a very information-based job, and even with the radio side, it's a very information-based job because I'm literally a person that gives people information. I've done both. Believe me, the farm work is much, much harder, and it takes far more skill. So even taking the politics of how much it'll hurt him aside, just taking his argument in a vacuum and what he's saying, it's absolutely untrue. That is a far harder job to do, and I'm not just talking about because it's physically exhausting, which of course it is. The range of skills that a farmer has to have, because he has to be such a jack of all trades, it's not even funny. He's got to be an amateur meteorologist. He's got to be an amateur mechanic, an amateur veterinarian if he has animals, an amateur biologist if he has plants. Well, biology would fall into both, but plant specialist. You have to be an agronomist. You have to know your soil and know what's working, what's not working. I mean, there's so many moving parts to running any kind of agricultural any kind of agricultural enterprise. It's an incredibly difficult job, and you have to be very sharp to be able to be successful at it. And by the way, American farmers are very successful at it. And this is where this elitist bullcrap from a New York billionaire comes in. And this is the reason that watching that, you perceive it that way. The innovation and intellect of American farmers are the reason we have an information economy. Yes, nowadays, very few of our people, a little less than 2% of people, are directly involved in production agriculture. Why? Because American farmers were so innovative and so good at their jobs and so smart and so skilled that very few of them had to farm anymore. They literally created the information economy and an environment in which it could exist because they were producing so much food that most people didn't have to work directly for their food like they did at one time. You see, that's the irony in all of this. He's degrading the very people and saying that, oh, their job's easy, anybody could do it. Yeah, well, not everybody could do it. And because so few people could do it, we had to innovate and get better at it. And when we did, that created the economy that he's talking about. New York City would not survive, and it's funny, we were just talking about that beforehand in my on the road, or out on the town segment. A place like New York City simply could not survive if American farmers were not incredibly good and incredibly skilled at their job. And you could say, oh, well, I was talking about there's a difference in modern farming and past farmers. Okay, well, New York City in the way that it exists right now would not be able to have existed if it were not for former farmers before modern farming that created the innovations to create modern farming. And so this is just a massive foot and mouth moment for Michael Bloomberg. He has no idea what he's talking about, and he puts that on glaring display for everybody to see. Anybody that knows anything about agriculture or the agricultural innovations that have happened over the past 200 years can very easily see why that is an incredibly ignorant statement to make. And anybody that actually has done farming realizes how much more complicated it is than that, whether you're talking about modern farming or farming in the past. Oh, you just put the seed in the ground and the corn comes up. No, it doesn't. There's an awful lot involved in the middle there. Because believe me, if you go out there on plowing day and plow the field and just stick the corn in the dirt and leave it, it ain't going to be up by the time harvest comes. There's 10,000 different things that can go wrong between now and then, between the planting time and the harvest time. And guarantee if it can go wrong, it will go wrong. Now, granted, corn's a little hardier than most crops, but even it, like, you have to take care of it in all that time in between, and it's not just random manual labor. There's a lot of skill involved. And for Bloomberg to make a statement of that just shows he is completely devoid of understanding of how that whole thing works. And I think that this winds up, because it is such a politically charged and stupid statement to make, I think this is the same thing that Hillary Clinton said about coal miners. Because you'll remember she made a crack about just getting rid of the coal industry and it's outdated and we don't need it anymore. Well, what happened is that states that depend heavily on coal for their economy, those people saw that as a complete degrading of them and their lifestyle and came out in droves to vote against her. Did it make a huge difference in the election? Probably not, because states like West Virginia and Kentucky were probably going to go for Donald Trump anyway, but maybe it made a difference. And in any case, it certainly didn't help her. And I think that this is a similar thing with Michael Bloomberg. Just as a general rule, as politicians, it's never a smart idea to degrade a certain lifestyle or an entire group of people sort of generically like that. If you're going to make a comment or a criticism about a specific person, depending on the circumstance, that may be politically fine to do. That's very different than attacking an entire group or class of people. That's never a smart idea. And the irony in all of this is, Bloomberg is making a statement about a profession with which he has no knowledge, and the reason that he has no knowledge and no firsthand experience is because the farmers have been so innovative as they've created a world where a person doesn't have to have any direct influence by agriculture. So it is ironic that the reason that he doesn't have that information, that he doesn't have that first-hand experience or even second-hand experience with agriculture, the reason that he is able to be so ignorant of it is because of the innovation of farmers that created a society where food was so abundant and so easy to receive and so cheap that we could have jobs and whole industries that have nothing to do with production agriculture. That's the thing that's so funny in all of this, is it is the farmers that were so darn good at their job that are the reason that elites like Bloomberg that have lived in a city their whole life don't know anything about it. It is a testament to the hard work and innovation and the skill of the American farmer, whether Bloomberg wants to believe it or not. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Today's chaplain report comes from the book of 1 Kings, and since it is President's Day, and because we are talking about this, I think that it's really only appropriate that we take a second to look at what God sees as the ideal leader for a people or as a nation. And sometimes the way to understand what the ideal is to look at the exact opposite of that, to look at somebody that fell short in all of those categories, and that's going to be the subject of our chaplain's report today. So we go first to 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 52. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father, in the way of his mother, in the way of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Now, that last phrase right there, where it talks about King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, being one who caused Israel to sin, that was something that was very jarring to me the first time that I saw it. And maybe it's because my own mentality comes from such an individualist point of view, and maybe it's also a combination of my own understanding of the theology of the Scripture. Because we'll see in the Torah, even back in the Old Law, that no man shall bear the sin of his father, nor the father bear the sin of his son, that everybody's accountable for his own sins, and you're not going to punish the father for what the son did, and vice versa. The Bible takes a very individualistic approach. It takes less of an individualistic approach in the beginning in the Old Testament because God was the God who looked after the nation of Israel. He looked after other nations, of course, too, but the primary narrative is God preparing the way of the Christ and doing so through the people of Israel. The New Testament, of course, moves to a borderless nation of God that goes beyond any kind of physical realm, and as Jesus said, his kingdom is not of this world. And so it's able to take a little bit more individualistic approach. But even back in the Old Testament, you still weren't held accountable for sins that other people committed. And so I looked at that verse and I was like, well, now wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. How can a king cause a nation to sin? You can't be held accountable for bad things that your leaders did. And so it caused this real schism in me where I had to dig deep and try to figure out exactly what was going on here, what was that verse saying, what all was implied with the Bible saying that King Jeroboam caused Israel to sin. So here's eventually what I came up with. How can one man cause a nation to sin? I think that the first step that you have to take in figuring out exactly what that means is, what did Jeroboam do? What did King Jeroboam do in his life that would have led him to cause Israel to sin, as the Scripture says? Well, Jeroboam committed treason against Solomon. Solomon was the king at the time, and Jeroboam basically said that he was going to take the kingdom away from Solomon. Solomon and he they were very mad at each other, and Jeroboam actually fled to Egypt. But he had committed treason against his king. And then, after Solomon died and his son Rehoboam took over, Jeroboam went to Samaria and wound up becoming king. So he was involved in treason against Solomon, And then after Solomon died, he was also involved in splitting the kingdom and becoming the king of the northern kingdom, despite the fact that King Rehoboam was still ruling in Jerusalem. So he helped split the nation. He also changed the days of the feast, changed the rituals of the laws of Moses. He adjusted things, and part of the reason he did that is because he wanted power. It was so important to him to consolidate his power and say, hey, no, God is really with us. He's not with those people in Jerusalem. And he was so concerned about people slipping away and joining back up with Jerusalem and the Jews in Judea and the children of Judah, that he wanted to make sure that it would be very difficult for them to do that. And so he started changing the days of rituals. He started changing how the rituals were done and who was conducting them and that kind of thing. He openly defied the law of Moses, the law that had been handed down to the children of Israel from God, because he was worried that his own power would go away, his earthly power, that his command over 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so ultimately, this is what happened, is that split took place. And he was like, no, we're not going to listen to the law of Moses anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to do things our own way, because then it's a lot harder for people to just reintegrate into being citizens of the united nation of Israel, to be under the kings that are in the lineage of King David. And probably, I would say, arguably the worst sin is in the same vein of trying to create that separate culture. He made altars to false gods. He actually made altars in the high places to worship gods that were not his God, that were not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was his great folly. That was the evil that he decided to engage in. And he was telling Israel, no, this is okay. We're going to do this. This is going to be part of who we are as a nation now. You know, there were experiments conducted in the wake of the Holocaust, because there were psychologists that were just fascinated with, how is it possible that a person could see the horrible, evil things that they were doing to Jews and other people in concentration camps and just think that it was okay to do them? They did this series of experiments, and I won't go into all the details because that's beyond the scope of our chaplain's report, but essentially their findings were, as long as a person in a position of authority told you it was okay, you would do it. Which terrifies me and should terrify every human being, that we are that open to suggestion. But ultimately, that's what happened with King Jeroboam in Israel. With the person in authority saying, no, it's okay to go worship other gods. It's okay to have these idols and to sacrifice to them. That's the legacy of King Jeroboam. Because I think ultimately we look at the deeds and then we have to look at the results. What happened as a result of King Jeroboam doing what he did? Well, there was not one single good king over Israel. Not one. Occasionally, in the lineage of David in Judah, now the majority of those kings were bad too, but occasionally a good reformer did come up. You had Hezekiah or Josiah or some other kings of Judah that would come to prominence in the southern kingdom, and they would start doing what God told them to do. Not a single one, not one in Jeroboam's line did. They were all bad. They were all rotten to the core. They all chased after foreign gods. And that's the legacy that he did. He also had his own kingdom ravaged by the Assyrians. That, of course, happened way after he died. But because of their folly, because of Israel's evil, God warned them with prophets over and over again, guys, you got to stop it. You got to knock it off, or you're going to be punished for that. You're going to fall into the Assyrians' rule. They ignored the prophets, killed most of them. And then, of course, the Assyrians wound up taking over. And because of that, the 10 tribes of Israel in the northern kingdom, they didn't survive. That's not to say that they were completely wiped out by genocide, because many of them weren't. But they bred in with other nations. They lost their lineage back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And because of that, they ceased being really Israelites. They were not culturally Jewish. They were not Jewish in the sense that their lineage came from Abraham. All of that went away. And to this day, the only Jews left are Jews. The word Jew comes from Judah. And that's because that was really the only tribe that survived. You had a few Benjamites and Levites that survived, but more or less, they were all gone. And so, because of that, the legacy of Jeroboam is destruction. He openly defied God. He was so worried about his own power that he was willing to ignore God's commands, and look where it led him. So, when the Bible says that he caused Israel to sin, his actions made it easier for people to defy God. And because of that, and because he created an environment in which following God was very hard to do, and doing it the way that God told him to do in the Torah was very hard to do, and following these false and evil gods, these made-up idols, was very easy to do, well, we see the results. Those lost tribes of Israel just aren't around anymore, and never will be again. You see, ultimately, kings like Jeroboam, leaders like Jeroboam, wind up doing far more harm for the people they are leading than good. Because anytime a leader makes it harder to do what God asks you to do, destruction is going to follow. And that's why if you are a leader, if you are somebody that has been put in charge of something, whether it's an entire nation or it's just your own household, you bear a very heavy burden. And that burden is to make those that are in your charge, make it as easy as possible for them to live the kind of life that God commanded them to do. Because if you don't, and the environment that you create makes it harder for them to do the right thing, their blood is on your hands. That's why we have to be very, very cautious and humble when accepting a role of leadership. Because leaders, especially when we're talking about politics, they can't make an individual sin. They can't make an individual person. They can't force him to do something wrong. But they can create that negative environment. And they can cause an entire nation, because of that environment, fall into sin and into decline, just like Jeroboam did. You see, this is exactly why our founders tried, with the presidency, to make it less important and less impactful and give those people less power. Because they knew that we were going to have some bad leaders. I mean, it's a human being. We're going to have some bad ones. We're going to pick some bad ones. That's who we are as a race. That's who we are as a people. And because our founders understood that and knew that, they said, you know what? We're going to give them as little power as humanly possible. We'll just have them do just the bare basic minimum. And then hope that the average person will do the rest, because if that's the case, at least they'll only mess up their own lives as opposed to everybody else's. That's why the founders were afraid of giving one person too much power, or the government itself too much power, regardless of what form it took. And that's the reason that on this President's Day, we're thankful for the office, at least as the founders intended it. A person that managed the country, but didn't have a whole lot of influence over the daily lives of the people. Because they knew the Bible. They looked through stories like this and saw how easy it is for power to corrupt people, and for that corruption to spread when that corruption is in the leader of a nation. That's why they tried to make the president less important. And that's why we as individuals ultimately should always look to God for our guidance. Not a government, not a king, not an individual. We follow God. And honestly, nothing else really matters. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.